It was the kind of night that carved itself into memory, the kind no one should travel in. The wind screamed across the open plains, dragging snow sideways like shards of glass. Jack Ransom sat alone in the dim glow of a dying fire, the shadows long and restless across the walls of his cabin. He hadn't listened for footsteps in years. No one ever came. The whiskey bottle by his elbow was half empty, untouched for hours. The silence around him was not peaceful, but heavy, hollow, the kind grief leaves behind when it's lingered too long. Then came the knock. Not loud, not urgent, just there. Soft, hesitant, like whoever stood outside wasn't sure they deserved to be heard. Jack didn't move right away. Ghosts didn't knock, but it came again, slower this time, like the cold itself had grown fingers. He stood heart slow and opened the door. She was there, barefoot, wrapped in a shawl, soaked clean through her face, streaked with melting snow and blood drying along her temple. Her eyes were wide but unreadable. She didn't say a word. Then she collapsed. Jack caught her by instinct. She was too light, too cold, trembling like a fawn in the middle of winter. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what had happened. He carried her inside, laid her down by the fire, and wrapped her in the old quilt his wife used to love. The moment he did, something shifted, like the silence he'd grown used to, had taken a breath it hadn't remembered it needed. Morning came slow and white. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in stillness. Snow hung on every fence post like forgotten linen. Inside Josie, he didn't know her name, yet remained curled beneath the quilt, her breath shallow, her forehead damp. Jack sat across from her, his mug of bitter coffee growing cold in his hands. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Her face twitched now and then, not from dreams he knew, but from the kind of memories that don't fade with sleep. Grief taught him the difference. She woke mid-morning, not all at once. A flicker of her fingers, a breath. Then her eyes blinked open, dazed and panicked. Jack didn't move. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here." She looked around like a cornered animal. He added, "I ain't gonna touch you. You fell outside. I brought you in." Still no words, just eyes like storm clouds full of thunder but no rain. He didn't press. He simply slid a plate toward her, eggs, toast, and dried apple. She stared at it, then at him. Her fingers, shaking slightly, picked up a slice. She didn't say thank you. But when she didn't run, when her shoulders dropped just a fraction, Jack knew she wasn't leaving. Not yet. The storm had moved on by morning, leaving behind a world hushed and white. Snow clung to the fences like old linen, and icicles hung from the roofline like glass daggers. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, reduced to a bed of glowing coals. But Josie was still there, curled beneath the patchwork quilt, her breath shallow, her brow slick with fever sweat. Jack Ransom hadn't slept. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, a mug of bitter black coffee cooling in his calloused hands. He watched her like he was waiting for a ghost to decide whether it wanted to stay or go. She hadn't stirred, not once through the long night, but her face kept twitching. Not the soft tremors of a dreamer, but the hard, jolting kind that came from memories too heavy to hold. Jack didn't need words to recognize that. Grief had taught him the silent language of pain. He'd lived long enough with his own shadows to know when another had walked through the door. Sometime near mid-morning, she shifted. Not all at once, just a flicker of fingers, the whisper of a breath. Her eyes fluttered open, blinked against the light, then went wide with sudden panic. She bolted upright, shoulders tense, eyes darting across the room like a hunted creature trying to figure out which way was safest. Jack didn't move. He knew better than to startle someone teetering on the edge. "Easy," he said, his voice low, gravelly, but not unkind. "You're safe here." She didn't reply, just sat there breathing fast and shallow like a deer caught too close to the hunter's rifle. "I ain't gonna touch you," he added, his hands open at his sides. "You fell out there. I brought you in, that's all." She still didn't speak. Her eyes were sharp, guarded, but there was something deeper too, something wounded. He asked, "You got a name?" She shook her head quick, like brushing off a question she didn't know an answer to. Jack nodded once. "All right," he said. "Don't need one." He stood, walked to the stove, and came back with a plate, toast, fried eggs, and a few slices of dried apple. He didn't offer it with ceremony, just slid the plate across the floor, careful not to get too close. She looked at the food, then back at him. Her fingers moved toward the toast, slow, unsure, then brought it to her lips. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Because when she stayed seated, when she didn't bolt for the door, when her shoulders dropped just a little, Jack understood. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not today. That understanding passed between them in silence, the only kind either of them trusted anymore. She didn't know his story, and he didn't ask for hers. Not because he wasn't curious, but because he remembered what it felt like to be asked too soon, before the ground beneath your feet stopped shaking. So he let the silence hold them both, not as a barrier, but as a beginning. The third day dawned quiet, not the empty kind of quiet Jack Ransom had grown used to over the years, but a gentler one. The kind where something unspoken begins to settle just barely, like snow softening on the edge of thaw. Josie moved through the cabin like a shadow, barefoot. Silent, careful not to touch too much, like she didn't want to disturb the dead. Jack let her be. He didn't follow, didn't ask her where she'd come from, or why there'd been blood on her face that first night. He remembered too well what it was like to be asked before the words inside you were ready. Instead, he watched her from a distance from the barn door that morning, arms crossed, breath fogging the cold air. She walked slowly toward the porch, wrapped still in that old patchwork quilt, her steps small and unsure. Her eyes roamed the yard, the fence posts rimmed with frost, the creaky rocking chair, the worn bench beneath the window that hadn't held anyone in years. When she stepped inside the house, she paused. Jack stood at the kitchen table, drying his hands on a rag. He didn't say anything. Her eyes, dark and distant, landed on the fireplace mantel and stopped. There, framed in cracked wood, was the only photograph Jack kept out anymore, a black and white image of a younger version of himself, arms wrapped around a barefoot woman in a cotton dress, her head thrown back in laughter. His wife. Long gone now, but the memory still sat where it always had, quiet and constant. Josie's face didn't change. She didn't ask who the woman was, but the air in the room shifted, subtle but deep, like someone had opened a door inside her and let something in or out. Jack noticed. He didn't say a word, just turned, picked up the frame, and held it for a second, his thumb running along its edge. Then, without ceremony, he opened the drawer beneath the bookshelf and placed it inside. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was no longer cold. It was permission. A moment later, Josie crossed the room and sat in the empty chair across from him, the one his wife used to favor in the evenings back when life still felt like something with a shape. Jack didn't look away, not this time. He met her gaze fully, and for the first time since the storm, he didn't see a stranger. He saw someone who had chosen to stay. Later that day, she swept the floor unasked, folded the quilt when she rose, drew water from the well, and brought it in without a word. It was the quiet rhythm of someone used to surviving through small, unnoticed acts, someone who didn't take space but earned it breath by breath. Jack didn't say a word, but he noticed everything, how she flinched when he coughed behind her, how her eyes jumped to the kettle when it began to whistle, things a girl who couldn't hear wouldn't react to. So that night by the fire, he spoke into the hush voice, low. "You hear things, don't you?" She froze, didn't look up, but her hands gripped the mug tighter. He waited, then added softly, "It's all right. Maybe silence ain't always what it seems." She didn't speak, but a moment later she nodded, just once, and the silence between them began to shift from distance to understanding. Nights on the ranch had always been slow quiet in a way most men couldn't stomach but Jack. Ransom had made peace with silence long ago. Now, though it was different, there was someone else in the stillness. Josie sat by the fire most evenings, her knees drawn to her chest, quilt wrapped tight, her hair damp from washing and clinging to her face. She stared into the flames the same way he used to. Like maybe there were answers flickering in the light if only you waited long enough. Jack would settle into the chair across from her, two chipped mugs of tea between them. He didn't speak much, but that night something stirred in him. He cleared his throat and said, "You ever hear of the horse that walked back 3 counties after being sold?" Her eyes didn't move, but her gaze shifted just enough to let him know she was listening. "Belonged to my brother Jack," went on, voice low. "Damn fool traded him for a saddle and a bottle. Horse broke out 2 nights later, turned up at our gate with the rope still dragging behind him." Josie didn't smile, but her hands relaxed. Jack noticed. "Some animals," he added, "they know where they belong, even when folks try to forget 'em." He kept telling stories, small quiet ones. About the stubborn dog he'd once had, about how his wife used to hum off-key while she cooked always the same song. Josie didn't speak, didn't laugh, but she listened. And each night something in Jack unraveled a little more, not in grief, but in release. He wasn't used to speaking without needing anything in return. No answers, no comfort, just presence. Then one night, as Josie stood to leave for her small room, she looked at him fully for the first time. In her eyes, Jack saw something fragile but fierce trust. Not because he'd earned it, but because she'd chosen to give it. By the end of that week, Josie moved through the house like it might belong to her someday. She didn't speak, still flinched at sudden noises, still paused at thresholds like she was asking permission. But she was no longer just passing through. That morning she baked bread for the first time. The dough didn't rise, the crust could have broken a tooth. Jack ate every bite without complaint. Later that night after supper, he pulled out something she hadn't seen before, a small worn leather book and a piece of chalk. He opened it to a page with rough sketches and letters. "Used to be my sister's," he said. "She couldn't talk much. Ma taught her these. I forgot most, but—" He held up 2 fingers to his lips, then pointed to her. "Thank you." Josie blinked slowly. Then hesitantly she mirrored the gesture. Her hand trembled, but she did it. Jack smiled, small, honest. They kept going, hungry, cold, safe. Each night they practiced. No pressure, no expectations, just a quiet rhythm between hands and hearts. Josie learned fast, not because of the chalk or the signs, but because for once no one expected her to speak. She began to answer with fingers, with glances, with action. She touched her heart when something moved her. Tapped once for no, twice for yes. Jack never pushed. He just made space, and slowly, without knowing how, they built a language, not of words, but of trust. The wind returned one night, fierce, bitter, like it had unfinished business with the land. Clouds rolled in thick and low thunder, cracking sharp above the prairie. Jack Ransom stood in the barn, double-checking latches and calming the horses as rain began to pound the roofs. But his thoughts weren't with the animals, they were on Josie. She still startled at every slammed door and flinched at wind howling through the cracks in the cabin. When he'd left, she'd been by the fire, silent as usual. Now a knot twisted in his gut. When he stepped back into the house, it was empty. "Josie," he called, already knowing. His eyes caught it, the front door swinging in the storm, and just beyond it, tracks. barefoot, leading out past the gate toward the far pasture. "No," he muttered, grabbing his rifle but not his coat. Lightning flashed and he ran. The storm howled around him, rain lashing sideways, soaking him to the bone as he followed the fading tracks. He saw her at the edge of the field, crouched in the mud near the broken fence, arms wrapped around something small, a foal, soaked and shivering, barely alive. Josie had draped herself over the colt's body, shielding it from the worst of the storm with nothing but her own thin frame. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wild but clear, not afraid, not asking for rescue, just there, protecting. What in God's name? Jack's voice caught in his throat, but he didn't finish the sentence. He knelt, scooped the foal into his arms. Josie followed, slipping twice in the wet grass but never letting go of his sleeve. Back in the barn, Jack worked fast, rubbing down the foal, wrapping it in blankets. Josie moved beside him like she belonged there, fetching water, smoothing hay, her movements steady, sure, purposeful. When the colt finally lay still and breathing, Jack turned to her, chest heaving. "You could have been hurt," he said. She didn't flinch. He exhaled, steadier this time. "But you weren't." Then she did something she hadn't done before. She raised both hands, one flat, one curled in a circle, pressed them together, slow and deliberate, the sign for home. Jack froze. She hadn't signed safe. She hadn't signed thank you. She had signed home, and she meant here. The storm passed, leaving the world washed and silent. The morning light filtered into the barn, soft and golden, touching everything like a blessing. Jack found Josie asleep in the loft, curled in the hay near the stall, the foal breathing quietly below. A blanket rested on her shoulders, her hand dangling loosely over the railing, not clenched, not afraid, just there. He didn't wake her, just stood quietly looking at this girl, no, this woman who had once been too afraid to speak, too broken to be seen, now sheltering life with her own two hands. Later, when she came into the kitchen, hair tangled from sleep, cheeks pink from cold, she didn't flinch at the sound of his boots. She didn't shy away. She washed her hands, set 2 mugs down, one for him. Then, without words, Josie reached out, not to brace herself, not to recoil, but to place her fingers gently over his. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Jack Ransom felt something shift deep in his chest. Not fear, not protection, belonging. The town of Edmonton was small, where gossip moved quicker than horses and memories stuck harder than mud after a storm. Jack Ransom didn't go in often, just when the ranch needed salt, nails, or flour. But this time was different. Josie had asked to come. Not with words, but with eyes and gestures, a slow, sure insistence that she was ready to see the world beyond the fence line, not to run from it, but to understand it. So he brought her. She wore a faded blue shawl he'd found tucked deep in an old trunk. Her hair, usually kept tucked and low, was loose, falling silly over her shoulders. She held herself taller than he'd ever seen. But the moment they stepped off the wagon, the stares started. Whispers snapped through the air like dry twigs. "Is that her?" someone muttered. "The girl from the foothills. Didn't her pa trade her for a bottle?" Jack kept walking, jaw tight, shoulders square. Josie stayed close, her hand curling around the edge of the wagon seat, not holding him, just grounding herself. Inside the general store, the clerk raised a brow. "She yours?" he asked, voice slick. Jack didn't blink. "She's under my roof." The man gave a half smirk. "That what they call it now?" Josie stood frozen near the doorway. Jack stepped forward and set the sack of grain down harder than he meant to. "She works, she eats, she lives in peace, and she's owed respect like anyone else." The clerk grumbled and rang up the sale. Jack didn't care. On the ride home, Josie didn't sign, didn't gesture, but her hand reached for his again, not trembling this time. Steady, strong. As the ranch came into view, the sky stretching wide and golden above them, Jack finally broke the silence. "They don't know you. Don't get to name you." Josie looked at him, eyes sour but shining, and slowly raised her hands. She formed the sign for safe and pressed it to his chest. When Jack covered her fingers with his touch didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like a promise. The days began to stretch like long shadows across the prairie, golden light lingering just a little longer each evening. The quiet between Jack Ransom and Josie had changed, no longer filled with tension or guarded pauses, but with the gentle rhythm of understanding. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in bruised purples and honeyed orange, Josie pulled a small bundle from beneath her shawl. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a square of faded fabric stitched with delicate patterns in muted reds, yellows, and blues, a patchwork that seemed to whisper of another world. She pressed it into Jack's weathered hands, her eyes searching his face, not for answers, but for space. Jack turned the cloth over, fingers tracing the threadbare symbols, river-like lines, unfamiliar markings, ancient shapes. He didn't know the story, but he knew it was sacred. He looked up and nodded, voice soft. "I don't need to know everything. Not yet, but I'm here." Josie's fingers brushed his lightly in response, hesitant but present. In that moment, the past felt less like a wound and more like a thread. Something not to be hidden but gently woven into the fabric of what might come next. Their peace was tested just days later. At sunset, the sound of hooves carried across the fields, low and ominous. Jack stood on the porch, his hand tightening on the railing. A group of riders approached, dust rising behind them like smoke. Men from town, hard eyes, stiff shoulders, riding with intent. Josie stepped up beside him without a word. Her hand slipped into his, not in fear but solidarity. One of the men dismounted, spit into the dirt. "We heard you're harboring trouble. Girl like that doesn't belong. Bought from a drunk, wild thing." Jack didn't flinch. His voice came steady. "She belongs to this land now. Old debts don't fade," the man shot back, eyes cold. Josie didn't hide. She stood tall, gaze unwavering. Jack stepped forward, voice like thunder now. "No debts will touch her here. Not while I breathe." Tension cracked like dry wood. The riders hesitated, muttering between themselves. Then slowly they turned and rode off, swallowed by dusk. Inside, the fire cast long, trembling shadows on the walls. Jack sat down heavily. Josie stood across from him, eyes not afraid but lit with something fierce and calm. She crossed the room, knelt by the fire, and reached out. Her fingers brushed the scar on his hand, a mark from a long-ago fight. Her touch was reverent, not out of curiosity but recognition. "I'm yours," she signed, voice silent but clear. Jack stared into her eyes, feeling the truth in that gesture. He nodded slowly. "We're a team now. Always." That night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, they sat close, not out of need but of choice. The weight of the world still pressed in, but between them grew a quiet strength. A bond forged not in haste or rescue, but in shared silence, patient trust and quiet defiance. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning. The next morning, the sun spilled into the ranch house like a promise. Josie stood by the window light, catching the curve of her cheek, her eyes clear and steady. Jack walked up beside her, reached for her hand. No words passed. None were needed. Together they faced the open plains, two broken souls who had chosen each other. Not out of rescue, out of love, out of home. The days that followed moved like soft wind through prairie grass, unhurried but full of meaning. A quiet rhythm took hold of the ranch, the kind that comes not from routine but from healing. Jack Ransom would wake each morning to find Josie already sitting by the window. tracing invisible shapes on the glass with one finger, her eyes following the sunlight as it crept over the frost-dusted hills. She rarely spoke, still cautious, still carrying old ghosts in the corners of her mind. But something had changed. The fear that once curled around her shoulders like a shawl had loosened its grip. Their silence was no longer empty. It was steady, familiar, shared. One morning, Jack returned from the post office with a bundle of old letters. Dusty, unopened, forgotten until now. Josie watched him from across the room, curiosity flickering in her eyes like a match unsure if it wanted to burn. He sat at the worn table, spread the letters out, and chose one. His voice was quiet when he began to read stories of far-off places, moments of laughter, and lost tales of ordinary people making a life out of very little. As the words drifted into the room like music, Josie leaned closer, her hand resting lightly on the table between them. She didn't sign, didn't interrupt. She listened, fully. Later that day, she pulled a scrap of paper from the cupboard and began to draw horses galloping across wide plains, a cabin nestled under tall trees, a stream winding through mountains. When she showed it to him, Jack didn't just see a drawing. He saw her hope, her future. "We'll make that place," he told her, voice thick with conviction. "Together." And so they began. They planted a garden, crooked rows, stubborn soil, and laughter, when Jack couldn't tell spinach from sage. They mended fences side by side. Josie brushed the foal's coat until it gleamed, and Jack swore the animal trotted taller with every touch. She rode with him now, her hair undone in the wind, eyes wide and unafraid. The townsfolk started nodding when they passed, not all, not yet. But enough. Respect was slow, but it was coming. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in watercolor hues, Josie did something unexpected. She reached for Jack's hand. Not gently this time, not hesitant. Her fingers wrapped around his with surety, both hands anchoring her in the moment. Her eyes locked on his, steady as ever, and though no words came, her message was clear. "I'm ready." Jack nodded, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "So am I." This was no longer survival, no longer a halfway house between fear and safety. This was the start of something real. The seasons turned subtle but sure. Seedlings stretched toward sunlight, the foal's legs grew stronger, and the ranch began to breathe in new ways. At night under the stars, Josie would sometimes rest her head on Jack's shoulder. He'd wrap an arm around her, not as a shield, but as a promise. There was no need to speak. Every shared silence told the story better than words ever could. One morning with spring thick in the air, Jack found Josie outside before dawn. She was standing barefoot in the dew-kissed grass, hands clasped in front of her, watching the sun rise. He joined her, and for a long while they stood in silence. Then she turned, placed her palm gently against his chest, and signed one word, "home." And this time Jack didn't just believe it. He felt it. Spring crept onto the land like a whisper, soft, green, patient. Life began to return in cautious breaths. The wildflowers that lined the fence posts bloomed in pale purples and shy yellows, and the morning air carried the scent of sage and damp earth. Jack Ransom moved through the ranch with practiced ease, his boots leaving faint impressions in the warming soil. But it wasn't just the land that was changing. Josie had begun to rise with the sun, no longer out of fear or habit, but something deeper. Hope. She would sit on the porch steps, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the sky. Sky brighten as if it held answers she was finally ready to ask. Their silences had grown into a kind of language richer than speech. Jack no longer filled it with stories unless she wanted them. Josie spoke now in gestures, glances, the way her fingers would reach across the space between them to rest lightly on his arm, not seeking reassurance but offering it. One morning she placed a drawing in his hands. A house framed by pine trees, a corral full of horses, children's footprints in the dust. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Jack looked up, eyes shining. We'll build this. Not a house, a life. Together. The ranch thrummed with quiet motion. Josie brushed the foal's mane each day until it gleamed in the sun. Jack taught her how to repair saddle leather, her fingers steady now, nimble with purpose. They planted tomatoes and onions in crooked rows behind the barn. Every time Josie laughed rare. Sudden like a spring thunderclap, Jack felt something old and cold inside him finally crack loose and melt. But the world beyond the ranch hadn't forgotten her. Whispers still curled along the dusty road from town. One morning, Jack returned from the general store with a fresh coil of rope and wary eyes. "They're still talking," he said quietly, setting the supplies on the table. Josie nodded once. Her face didn't fall. It hardened like iron cooling in water. She walked over, took his hand, and signed, "I stay." That night, the wind carried the low rumble of approaching horses. Jack stood at the gate, shoulders squared. Josie joined him. She didn't hide behind him. She stood beside him, her hand curled into his. The men came with half-truths and accusations. Jack answered with silence and steel in his voice. "She belongs here. You don't decide that." When the men rode off, swallowed by darkness and dust, Jack turned to Josie. "You still sure?" Josie didn't answer in words. She stepped close, her hand finding his chest, her gaze unwavering. "You are my home," she signed. And Jack, for once in his life, didn't feel the need to carry the world alone. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. Josie moved with ease through the small space, humming quietly, the tune off-key and unfamiliar, but somehow just right. Jack poured coffee, watching her with something like awe. A girl once silent-souled and scarred, now building belonging. When she sat across from him, their knees brushed beneath the table. Neither moved away. "Can I show you the back pasture today?" Jack asked softly. Josie smiled. "Small, real." "Yes," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse but hers. And outside, the prairie bloomed. In a world that often moves too fast and demands too much, the story of Jack Ransom and Josie reminds us of the quiet power of presence, patience, and human connection. This isn't a tale of grand gestures or loud declarations. It's about how healing happens in the silences between words, in the simple acts of kindness that ask for nothing in return. Josie, carrying trauma and silence like a second skin, didn't need someone to fix her. She needed someone to stay, to offer space instead of solutions, to listen without needing answers. Jack, weathered by his own grief, didn't save her by being a hero. He saved her by being available, by choosing compassion when fear or pain might have been easier. One of the most powerful lessons from their journey is that love, real love, is not always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up. It's a mug of tea set beside a scent hand. It's respecting boundaries without question. It's the quiet decision to protect someone not because they belong to you, but because they deserve peace. In our own lives, we can forget that healing doesn't demand eloquence. It asks for consistency. We don't have to be perfect to be what someone else needs. We just have to be honest, gentle, and willing to stay even when it's uncomfortable. This story also reminds us that our past doesn't define our future. With time, trust, and care, even the deepest scars can become stories not of pain, but of survival. And in the right hands, survival turns to belonging. Love isn't the absence of pain, it's the decision to build something beautiful in spite of it, one slow day at a time. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. Your support helps us bring more quiet stories of redemption, healing, and hope to life. Thank you for being here.